My presentation has 5 parts. I'm going to start off with a bit of the context. Then I'll move on to some concepts and overview of that. Then just a brief overview of level descriptors on the continent, and you will already know this, so it's basically a recap. Then Eduardo mentioned that we had a survey, and thank you to those who participated. It was kind of a very quick response. So within 1 week we got 31 responses. So this snapshot will be based on those responses. It might change going forward as we assimilate the other responses as well. Then I'll end my presentation with the challenges. So just to pick up on something that Andrea said, and I also want to just thank Andrea and Jens. A lot of what I am going to say is a bit of an overlap of what they have said, which is actually very good, I think, because it just shows that we're all thinking in the same way. It's a learning outcomes thinking. So I'll try not to repeat what has already been said. But Andrea said that when you have a regional qualifications framework, you need to understand the purpose, the scope, and the principles. This you already know, and it has been documented in the mapping study, the feasibility study, in all the peer learning workshops. When Eduarda presents, she takes you through this as well, so you know what the kind of aspirations are of the ACQF and what is the vision. That is important because the level descriptors is also a feature of a regional qualifications framework, and that is what this presentation is about. So this level descriptor guideline is one of 10 guidelines. You have already seen this. It is in the feasibility study as well. And each guideline has what we call a trio pack. It consists of a technical guideline, which is the core document. It will have all the underpinning technical policy discussions. Then there will be a synthesis guideline, which will be a shorter version. It will be based mostly on recommendations, and it is what the policy makers will be using. And then the training module. That will be important for our ACQF knowledge base and also for our e-learning platform. And I think that will be a nice opportunity for us to be able to write learning outcomes. You can see that's part of that training module. So we can kind of put into practice what do we think people should know, understand, and do after participating in that training. Everything will be tested and finalized before it will be disseminated at the regional level or at the continental level. So these are 10 guidelines. And what I've done in this slide is to just show you that all these guidelines are linked to each other. So nothing stands in isolation. That's where the guideline 2 is. The explicit link is between guideline 2 and the referencing criteria, which were mentioned by Andrea as well. And what we were saying that there are kind of 10 themes in referencing criteria. And we're saying those first 5 are actually the main criteria in referencing. And you can see the link to that as well. So guideline 2 will be explicitly linked to the referencing criteria, because one of the major outputs of the referencing criteria is to show how your NQF is linked to the African Continental Qualifications Framework. So just for some concepts which has already been mentioned by Andrea and by Jens, you need to understand the purpose of the regional qualifications framework. The learning outcomes based thinking, that should just permeate everything. And I've actually added in the definition from the Addis Convention, because the Addis Convention is a ratified document. It's active since December 2019, and we should actually be implementing it. So we don't have any excuse. You know, the learning outcomes thinking should be part of everything that we do. Then Andrea's also spoken about the development on 2 dimensions of logic. And then there's a lot that we can learn from other regional qualifications frameworks, especially the European qualifications framework, because they've been doing this for a long time, and they already have 36 countries that have reference to the European Qualifications Framework, so we can learn a lot from that process. So I'm glad that Jens also spoke about the glue. He said, you know, learning outcomes are the glue, you know, that binds all these policy documents and governance arrangements. It binds it all together. So that extends to the level descriptors as well, because that is the glue in the NQFs. And that learning outcomes thinking permeates into the way we write the level descriptors as well. So in terms of communication, level descriptors are the main communication tools between NQFs and RQFs, and in this case, the African Continental Qualifications Frameworks. It is that level descriptor that enables the countries to link their qualification descriptors or their qualification levels to the ACQF level. So back to the different purposes. So this is the regional qualifications framework on the right-hand side. Both are, they are both reference frameworks, I would say, an NQF and an RQF, both reference frameworks. It both reflects the nature and the scope of the NQF. Both are written as learning outcomes, but there's a distinct difference between the two. So at the regional level, that RQF will be a translation device or a reference for a number of countries to reference to it. There will be NQF level, there's a slight difference. And I'm going to add in, oops. So you can see at the level of the national qualifications frameworks, that is where the complexities of the qualifications, that is where it is reflected. And I don't want to go into a description of this, but the NQF level in the country will accommodate those qualification descriptors, and I've added an approach that we take qualifications and try to adapt it to their own level. So you can see there, at the generic level, it must be able to accommodate degrees, diplomas, certificates, and then you can kind of build in, you can say, so the degree at that specific level, what does it look like? What does a diploma look like? And it will have different purposes, different characteristics, different credits, different entry levels and pathways. So that is how you can go into much more detail at the level of the NQF. But at the regional level, there's not going to be any link to the qualification types. This is just to show you the example now, because we do not yet, at an African level, we do not yet have our number of level descriptors, and we don't have a set number of levels yet. So it's difficult to use an African continental qualifications framework example. But as I said, I'm using the European qualifications framework because they have made the most advancement out of all the regional qualifications frameworks. So here is the EQF, the red blocks in the middle. It's an 8-level regional qualifications frameworks. Now, it doesn't matter whether the countries that are referencing to the EQF, whether they have 10 levels or 4 levels or 5 levels or 12 levels, they are able to link their level descriptors or their qualifications levels by linking their level descriptors to the EQF. So the EQF serves as a reference point, and each country will say, these are our qualifications, this is how we compare. So they bring their qualifications into that public space. They make it explicit. Country B can look at country A's referencing report and say, okay, so level 6 of country A, it corresponds with level 5 of the EQF. And what people call a kind of a secondary kind of a translation is where the country B can say, our level 5 is sort of comparable to level 6. So because that comparability has already been determined. But I want to also stress that even though this referencing has happened, it is not an automatic recognition. So as Andrea mentioned also, that there is when you write level descriptors, or when people talk about you describing level descriptors, there's a horizontal logic and there is a vertical logic, and level descriptors are normally written in a matrix. And I've used 12 levels here so that we don't say it's either 8 level or 10 level, but I've used 12 levels because your levels of complexity will be on your vertical axis, and at your horizontal it will be your domains like knowledge, skills, responsibility, autonomy, and so on. And both of these, there's an interplay between all of that which will inform your level of complexity. So at the horizontal level, in an NQF, it is normally what is important to that specific country. So it's going to be reflected in the qualification. And you can normally see it in the purpose. Why does the country have this NQF? And that it will reflect, so the domains that the country chooses, it will reflect the purpose. Universally, most qualification frameworks have knowledge and skills. And then, as Andrew also mentioned, that third contentious domain, it can be application, it can be autonomy and responsibility, competence, and so on. But mostly qualifications frameworks have knowledge and skills in it. I also just included some of what Jens had said and some of what Andrea had said. So in terms of clarity, we want to define those domains and those subdomains, and we want to include what is reasonable at the level of the ACQF. And what is not desirable, and I've actually put it in red because, you know, when you have 55 countries and you want to listen to everyone, we might get to a stage where there's too much detail, because if it's too overcomplicated, it will not be able to be implemented. Too many domains, overcomplicated framework, it's just not going to, it won't be implementable. In terms of vertical also, you know, the desirability, clarity, understanding and agreement on the levels, firstly, number of levels, and then the levels of complexity, and then how they are comparable. When Andrea was speaking, she said some people do refer to levels of learning progression, but sometimes there is no basis for saying progression, so you rather look at the levels of learning complexity, and that must be cumulative in nature. I've just used 5 regional qualifications frameworks here that you can just see, you know, and I've highlighted the knowledge and skills so that you can see that this is kind of the universal trend. At the regional qualifications framework level, you must be able to reflect some of the domains of your participating AQF. So when we're writing these domains, when we're saying these are the domains that we want at the African level, we must have done some research on the African domains already available. And also the ACQF can include, you know, what do we want to encourage in the NQFs of member countries. So we can also look at that, and especially in innovation and so on, future-oriented NQF. Some of these principles have already been mentioned, and I've just tried to combine from a number of regional qualifications frameworks. So the first thing is, at the ACQF level, we are already saying that as the purpose of this of the ACQF, we are covering all forms of learning. So it doesn't really matter what it is. We just the ACQF must be able to cover everything. It deliberately uses general language, you know, because we don't have to capture any complexity of a national qualifications framework, which I explained earlier on. So the language will be very, very generic and very independent. Then the African Continental Qualifications Framework, the level descriptors will encompass all components of transparency. The learning outcomes approach, which has already been mentioned, there needs to be some validation of learning from non-formal and informal contexts. the placement of qualifications in NQF levels and registers, and that is also very important in quality assurance and trust, because where there are NQFs, people also want to know, so what is the process that you, when you allocate a level to that qualification type, what is your process? Is it quality assured? Who's involved? And so on. And then these registers of qualifications, what does it look like? You know, some people call it a catalog, some people have it, say it's a database, but so what does it look like? Where is it accessible to everyone? And then very important, as Andrea also mentioned, it's the quality assurance aspect, the links with that. And then all of this, you know, it's even writing level descriptors, linking level descriptors, the national level descriptors to the ACQF. It's not just about linking levels. It is about coming together of different stakeholders. You know, it's a way to kind of integrate, maybe integrate is not the right word, but to synthesize all your learning outcomes at the various components of learning outcomes and the various quality assurance processes. It's a way to bring it all together and say, this is our national qualifications framework, or this is our national qualification system. Here it is all integrated, and this is how it compares. So it is that collaborative element that is very important as well. Then we said the level descriptors must be developmental. So each one must imply a higher level of complexity of learning. We must be able to distinguish the lower and the higher levels. And maybe that is not such an easy thing to do, because you know, you want to have repetition must be avoided. So there's quite a lot of things to think about there. And then also the taxonomies, as Andrea also pointed out, you know, it's the revised Bloom is quite popular for the for taxonomy in the learning outcomes approach. Then the last point here, and by no means the least, is that conceptual and technical clarity and consistency. And I've been part of learning outcomes workshops where people are just saying, you know what, it's just too confusing. We don't understand it. So I think that will be a big challenge to make sure that it is clear. The definitions must be crystal clear, and you know, the definition at each level. Positive statements, jargon-free, non-technical, you know, it must be transparent. That non-expert reader must be able to read those outcomes and the level descriptors and say that we understand what this means. So just to recap on what research has already been done, there was a mapping study, a feasibility study, and then we have a number of thematic briefs, and then also the peer learning webinars. And I've highlighted this thematic brief here, the level descriptors 3.1, which was done by Eduarda. So you can already see, you know, what are the kinds of domains, where are we in terms of NQF thinking, and this is taken from that from the thematic brief. So we already have an African NQF snapshot. We already know what is happening in the country. And then also taken from the feasibility mapping, the level descriptor snapshot. So how does it look? What does Africa look in terms of qualifications framework levels? Where are we? We can see that the majority is the 10 level. So we've got 12 at the top in the NQF, so 11 in SADC, plus Kenya, which is 12. They are, I think Namibia isn't there, but I don't think Namibia was part of that. And then we've got one regional qualifications framework, which is SADC qualifications framework, and it's a comprehensive qualifications framework. And then we've got some 8 levels, we've got 7 levels, we've got sector qualifications framework, 6 levels and 5 levels, and then we've got another regional qualifications framework, and that focuses on higher education. So it's the East African qualifications framework for higher education. So that is the snapshot on, so how many levels do we already have on the continent? Then you will also find in that documents, you will find a long list of domains from these qualifications frameworks, that have been researched. And from that long list, we developed a short list of 13 possible ACQF domains. Now you see we've split up autonomy and responsibility because it doesn't necessarily mean that it needs to be one. So we've split it up into autonomy and responsibility and autonomy and responsibility because we just wanted to see, these are the 13 top domains, and we also put it in the survey to find out what do people think of these domains. What is the priority? What do they think about it? Then we also needed to think about, so where do we place innovation? So what is the role and place of new skills? We're always talking about green skills, digital skills, social skills. What are the other skills? So we wanted to know, where do we place this? And in the survey, we gave 3 options. We asked people if they would like it to be a separate domain, or do they think it must be a subdomain in one of these domains here in the yellow? Or do they think it mustn't be explicit as a domain at all, but it needs to feature in another guideline document or another ACQF tool? So we asked them that in the survey. And also just looking at the European Qualifications Framework, how did they include innovation? So they've included it in under skills and under knowledge and under responsibility and autonomy. You can read a little bit more about this in Andrea's paper as well. So just to get a feeling of what did another regional qualifications framework do. So coming to our survey results, as I said, it was very quickly, we asked people, and it was 1 week. We had 31 responses from Africa, Europe, and from Australia. Most of the people were representing an NQF. Then we combined the learning outcomes responses with the level descriptors responses. We combined it to see, what is the kind of pattern that we see, from the responses that we received. And as I said, these responses may change, as more people engage in the survey. So you can see here that the TVET sector is leading in agreement and use of both the learning outcomes and in terms of level descriptors, followed by higher education, and then it looks like it's the least popular in general education. So the brown line is general education, which we see as primary and secondary. We also asked people to identify what the scope is of the NQF or the NQS. So when you see NQS as National Qualification System, NQF as National Qualifications Framework, we asked them about the scope of the NQF, and we also asked them, so this process of classifying qualifications in your NQF or your NQF, we wanted to know how is this applied, and we wanted to know whether it was consistent for, whether it's all types or so on. And we saw that the results were kind of similar. The scope and the classification in the NQF, the majority responses were saying all levels of qualifications. The least popular response were micro-credentials, and I've looked at some of the comments that people were making, and I don't want to go into all the comments for this presentation. I'm just highlighting, what were the quantitative responses. But some people were saying that they don't necessarily use the word micro-credential. Some people might think that part qualifications and micro-credentials is the same thing. Some people don't speak of it as micro-credential or part qualification, but they talk about smaller qualifications. So it may be a matter of terminology, but we haven't unpacked that in detail. So then we looked at what is this process when you classify the qualifications in your NQF or your NQS? And the most popular response was that it was based on a comparison of the NQF level descriptors with the learning outcomes of the qualification. So that was the main the criteria for pegging this qualification on the NQF. Even some people said only quality assured qualifications. It was the least popular response, but I don't think there's such a big difference in between 15 and 20. Then we also asked about what bodies are involved in this classification process. And we see quality assurance agencies, NQF decision-making bodies, and national qualifications authorities kind of at the top end. And then the least involvement seemed to come from labor and sectoral councils. And when I read some of the comments, they were saying that labor and sectoral councils only need to be involved at the level of the actual qualification, but at the NQF level, then it's too many people. It just causes too much confusion. Then we asked about, so what are the features of your level descriptors? And you can see some of what Andrea has said and some of what Jens has said there. So we based it on some of the international literature that we were reading. And it looks like the majority was saying that the level descriptors, that logic, that vertical and horizontal logic basis for picking a qualification on the NQF, vertical levels of complexity, it seems that people could agree that the level descriptors had those features. And in the minority were most of those technical clarity, language aspects. I was a bit surprised to see that the level descriptors in practice is the same as the NQF, because we also placed that in under this, and that was also on the low end, and maybe people are just not aware that this is actually happening. So I think we've got a lot of work in terms of the clarity and the language and the jargon. We've got a lot of work in making sure that the level descriptors at the African level, that it's not going to be confusing for people. Then we also asked people about, what are the features of their learning outcomes? And we'll start with a high end. So like people were saying, learner mobility seems to be the most popular answer. Then also guides design, description, and recognition of qualifications specific to a subsector, cascades from the level descriptors, although some of the comments did say that some of these learning outcomes approaches were in place before there were level descriptors. So it's not just cascading from the level descriptors, but it's an interplay between the learning outcomes and the level descriptors. And then obviously the issue of lifelong learning, they felt that they could see that. At the low end, supported by research and tools, I could understand that. And even, people weren't too sure that it was contributing to societal or labor industry needs. But what I was very sad to see was the link to assessment here in the low end. And Jens mentioned in his presentation that, assessment must be aligned with learning outcomes. So we will need to do some work there as well. Then we spoke about referencing, and we asked people what would they think would be the benefits of referencing to the African Continental Qualifications Framework. The most popular response was that it's going to contribute to the internationalization of African NQFs or NQS. And I was very happy to see this automatic recognition, because we put this in just to check the temperature, to check, what is the expectation? What do people expect from referencing? Because referencing does not imply automatic recognition, and we were very glad to see that there were only about 10 responses there. And some of the written comments where people were also saying, it's not automatic recognition, but we put that in just to check the expectation. So coming to this number of ACQF levels, the very big question, how many levels? And you've already seen that from the research, we've given you that breakdown in terms of 10 levels, 8 levels, 7 levels, 6 levels. So we also asked people, what do you think, how many levels should the ACQF have? And the 64% said 10 levels. So there's another, and some people were saying you cannot ask this in a questionnaire, you must do the research. The research was done. We also put it in the questionnaire just to check the kind of temperature. Then, as I said, we used a short list of domains, and we asked people to rank it in order of priority. What do they think, it's the top priority for the African continent? And that is what came out. So it's knowledge, skills, competence. So that will be the top 3. And some people also said that we shouldn't have too many domains. So some people saying focus on top 5, focus on top 3. So that will be the top 3. And just as an interesting aside, the European Qualifications Framework, when they started out, they their level descriptors were knowledge, skills, and competence. And then later on, as they were implementing, they realized that competence is actually autonomy and responsibility. So you'll see if you read the documents that they changed from knowledge, skills, and competence to knowledge, skills, and autonomy and responsibility. So we might just need to look at that as well. Then, as I also said, we asked people where do they think we need to include innovation, and we gave that 3 scenarios. And I think people would definitely said definitely not a separate domain, so that grey, the 27%, definitely not a separate domain. And there was a kind of a toss-up between, you know, it can be a subdomain of one of the domains, or it does not have to be explicit at all in the level descriptors, but it must form part of a African Continental Qualifications tool or another guideline. Which brings me to the end of my presentation. This is the last slide. So the challenges, and you know, while people were talking about level descriptors and learning outcomes, there's a lot of challenges, you know, but we also need to look at, so what, how do we want this to benefit the African continent? We know the objectives, we know the vision, we know the scope of the ACQF, we know how we're supposed to write these level descriptors. So in terms of the conceptual technical design, what must we agree so that the ACQF can benefit the people on the continent? And then the definitions of the levels, the definitions of the domains, the definitions of the descriptors, so that it's inclusive and future oriented. You know, how do we agree on that? No, so what is how are we going to have some kind of agreement on that? Then this learning outcomes thinking, you know, and in the different contexts of learning, we're talking standards, program, assessment, certification, renewal of qualifications, adaptation to new demands and technologies. How are we going to structure this? And this is also one of the guidelines that we are working on for the ACQF. Then the whole issue about management of qualifications, whether people talk about registers, databases, catalogs, how do we ensure the transparency in the management of that? You know, that's also a way we build trust. Another way we build trust is through quality assurance. So what are these quality assurance principles and mechanisms at the level of the framework, and how do we filter it down into the country level? And then very important is validation of learning, including RPL, which includes non-formal and informal learning. So these are the challenges, and you know, that we need to when we're approaching this level descriptor document, that we need to bear in mind. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. My presentation is complete.